Happy Monday, PLNU. This morning for the Curated piece, we have dipped back into the chapel archives and pulled what feels like an incredibly timely message from psychology professor Dr. Oakes Mueller on the human experience of anxiety. We also hope you will enjoy a video that was created around a song that we have really enjoyed singing together in chapel this year, Be Still. You can find that on the PLNU Chapel Instagram page through the link in the bio, and also on the YouTube page through the link in the description. We hope both of these things will bless you and just be good reminders in this season to really rest and be still. Know that you're loved and missed. Take good care.
So I'm going to begin by actually saying a little bit about what is happening in our bodies when anxiety strikes us. So let's imagine, I'm going to stick as close to your lived life as I can. Imagine walking from here. Imagine this to the degree you feel comfortable. Imagine walking from here into your next class. You're a minute or two late, and as you walk in, everyone else is focused heads down on the papers in front of them, writing furiously. You start to panic. You look at your professor, who kindly asks you if you would like a pencil for the exam that everyone else is now taking. You think yes, because you had no idea that there was an exam today. Let me tell you what is going on inside of you. Imagine yourself in that situation. In that moment, your body is mobilizing for threat. That's what anxiety does. Your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, there's one to drop at your next party, kicks into motion. It floods your body with cortisol or adrenaline. You start breathing faster. Your palms begin to sweat. Your heart starts racing. And you feel like fleeing or fighting or freezing. Anyone ever felt this feeling before? Yes, congratulations, you're human. That is the feeling of, the embodied feeling of anxiety. And God speaks to embodied people. Now imagine what happens next. And I'll paint a couple different paths because we are different bodies. For some of you, you take a pencil, you sit down, you feel your palms sweat, but you take a few deep breaths, and you look for the first question that you know the answer to. And you start filling it out. You take a few more breaths, and you start filling it out. And you talk yourself down, and over time, your panic turns into alertness, turns into focus. Your heart rate declines, and your fear fades. This is what some psychologists call normal anxiety. It's what our anxiety is actually designed to do, to identify something that needs our attention in the environment, to focus us on it, to put everything else out of our mind, and to mobilize our bodies to start responding. Alternatively, path number 2. Imagine this. Upon seeing the exam, your mind freezes. Your heart starts racing uncontrollably. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid, and as a part of this hyperventilation, you start to feel dizzy, and your thoughts spiral out of control. You begin to think helpless, hopeless thoughts, and for some people, you even feel like in the moment you're dying. This type of intense anxiety, called clinical anxiety, in this example, a panic attack in particular, is all too familiar for many people. And many people sitting in this room today, maybe to your left or your right, or maybe the person sitting in your shoes. This is very common in people of deep and abiding faith, as well as those outside of the faith. This type of anxiety can strike one regardless of what you believe about God's grace and about God's control. In fact, while some of us may tend in these moments to blame our anxiety, or some of us may tend to blame your anxiety, that other person's anxiety, on a lack of faith or a lack of courage or a lack of willpower. You don't have to raise your hand, but let me know, think inside, have you ever felt that? That if I had more faith, perhaps I wouldn't feel this anxiety. Or if they had more faith, maybe they wouldn't feel it. Some people, I'll let you know, about 20% of a population are born with more highly reactive nervous systems. Literally, as infants, you can trace the 20% of the population that is more likely to develop these severe anxiety. not because they had less faith as infants, but simply because their bodies designed to react a little more intensely to novel stimuli. As adults, those of us who find ourselves more anxious tend to have overactive right hemispheres in our brain. We have more reactive cardiovascular systems. For those of you who have this kind of biological propensity, and there are a lot of you, there are 1,500 people in this room, there are 300 people who were born with heart rates that go up a little bit faster. And for those of you in the room hearing, do not be afraid. What you may hear, I think what's not being said, I think what God intends is not this, but what you may hear is, be another person, get another body, be someone else. It feels so impossible, like an impossible demand, to not feel anxiety in these moments, in part because it is sometimes impossible to not feel anxiety. So I want to say to you this. As the scripture says, do not be afraid, but allow yourself grace to feel afraid without it defining or owning who you are. So let me ask the second question. With all of these biblical admonitions to not fear that we see throughout the Bible, do not be ruled by fear. Why is it that we have this fear anyway? What is anxiety even for? If our bodies and our hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axes are gifts from God, what is this gift for? I think anxiety does a few things. I could spend a long time talking about these. I just want to mention a couple things. One of the things is anxiety helps us to monitor our environments. When it's working well, anxiety is a gut trigger that something is amiss. I should pay attention to something. There may be a threat or a danger around me. And alerting us when something is wrong. Which is great if you live in a small society in which we have no electronic media and in which the biggest threats only come by intermittently. You all are living in a digital culture in which those things you carry in your pockets are perpetual sources of minor threats. Sometimes imagined threats. The challenge is our sympathetic nervous system doesn't know the difference. It doesn't know the difference between a real threat out there and a possible threat. And so what happens day after day after day is your phone buzzes and you get pinged. And your anxiety goes up and it goes down. And some of you have the ability to recover, not necessarily because you have deeper faith, but sometimes merely because of the wiring in our nervous system. But when we ping it day after day after day, our general anxiety starts to rise. And we never get a chance for our bodies to come back down. But the gift of anxiety is that when used for the kingdom, our anxiety can actually serve as an antenna to monitor the people around us. To detect in our environment, is something wrong here? Is there a threat? In fact, is someone suffering? Is someone here uncomfortable? And if so, what can I do about it? Anxiety is also a means by which we learn things. We tend to think of learning as top-down, coming from our cognitions down into our mind and getting stored away. But actually, some of the greatest wisdom we develop is mediated through anxiety. Meaning, when you go to do something and you notice someone responds to you in a negative way, it pings a little anxiety. And the next time you go to do that, you're going to be a little bit more hesitant. Turns out, you can actually, for those of us who experience anxiety with any regularity, you may have wished to be one of those lucky people who never get anxious. Anyone feel like they know those people who just seem like to breeze through life? There's actually a reliable place you can go to find people who feel no anxiety at all, who have not suffered from that. When I ask my students, there's lots of things that usually come up. Monasteries, convents, Buddhist retreat centers, mountaintops. Turns out, actually, the best place to look for these people is prison. When you do not have anxiety, you don't begin to learn the small, wise lessons of interpersonal relationships. The small lessons of what hurts another person and what doesn't, what's going to get me in trouble and what doesn't. That anxiety is actually a gift when in moderation. It's a way that we can access practical wisdom. But like all knowledge, if we allow it to take over in every moment, it can also guide us towards folly. And last, anxiety is actually a condition of living. It is a moderate amount of anxiety is a natural and helpful response to realizing that I am living in real time in an actual body that can die. My life can get cut short, and I cannot do those things that I want to do. I cannot have that healing conversation in this relationship. This existential anxiety, again, when it's used well, when we listen to it as a source of wisdom and don't allow it to own us, is something that can draw us to make use of the time that we have here on earth. It can draw us to do those things that we want to be remembered by and to end each day with those relationships in the place that we want them to be. So once again, let's return to the question of why Christ may tell us to not be afraid. If anxiety can be so helpful, why not simply give in to it? And the answer actually comes in one of the great callings of Christ, to love the Lord our God with all our heart and our soul and our might and our strength, and to love our neighbor as ourself. It turns out, when we feel anxiety and then we allow ourselves to identify with that anxiety, when we not just feel anxiety, but we are anxious, don't just feel fear, but we are fearful, our vision narrows, and we stop responding to the other as if they were a neighbor. Fear tells us I'm in danger, and therefore, where's the threat? Oftentimes, he or she or they are the threat. When I feel afraid, it moves me to ask, just like the expert in the law did, and who is my neighbor? Who's the good guy? Which are the ones I should care for? Implying, of course, who's the bad guy, who's the enemy, or really, who are the people that I don't need to care about when I'm anxious and scared about myself right now? And usually the answer is the stranger, the other. The fear-oriented brain begins to view the other as a threat and asks, what is the source of danger? The stranger, the alien, them. So when I allow my anxiety to take over me, we close ranks and we exclude the other. So what do I do if, like many of you, I'm human and I experience anxiety? And this question, I think, applies to all of us. Whether we feel mild anxiety at meeting new people, or whether we've had moments in which we feel absolute panic and terror. How do I be not afraid and yet have grace for myself when I feel afraid? Because it turns out there's actually a big difference between being fearful, being anxious, and feeling fear. It may not seem like a big difference, but I want you all to pause for a moment. If you want, you can close your eyes. If you want, you can keep them open. You do whatever makes you most comfortable right now. But what I want you to do initially is to identify in your own mind, is there a thought or is there a place in my body that I feel anxious right now? What is that? Take just a moment and acknowledge that. The next thing I want you to do is actually take one hand and put it on your chest, one hand and put it on your stomach. And for about a minute, all I want you to do is to breathe. And as you breathe, see if you can breathe in a way that raises that bottom hand. Breathe through your stomach. If you can't, don't worry about it. But this is called abdominal breathing. It is a way that we, as embodied people of God, can use the gift of our body to bring our anxiety back under control. So take some deep breaths. And in fact, as a song said before, imagine breathing in the grace of God and holding it inside, and then breathing out the grace of God again. Breathing in and breathing out. This is actually one of the simplest things that you can do in any moment, no matter where you are, to manage your anxiety. Why? Because it also uses our body too. When you breathe slowly and deeply like this, it mobilizes your parasympathetic system. It mobilizes your calming system. And that part of your body helps to calm the other part of your body. It also works because when you're focusing on breathing and you feel that breath in and out, your focus is moved off of that about which you're anxious. It gives our minds a chance to rest. The second thing I want you to do, we'll take just a moment. Each of these we could do for a much longer time. But the second thing I want you to do, actually what I want 70% of you to do, and you'll figure out which 70% you are, is I want you to imagine sitting by a stream. There's typically about 30% of people who have a hard time imagining. It's just the way we're wired. If you're one of those 30%, keep breathing. Keep focusing on your breath. And come back to us in about 2 minutes. But I want you to imagine sitting by a stream and looking upstream. And as you look, you see a leaf floating down the stream. Now I want you to imagine on that leaf is whatever it is, whatever thought, whatever feeling, whatever event in your life is making you anxious. Imagine it like a leaf floating down the river. This is the way that our thoughts come to us. They drift in, and then quite often they drift out. But imagine that leaf coming down the river, or keep breathing. And as the leaf comes to you, imagine picking it up and examining it in your hand, turning it over, and just being curious about it. When we are anxious or are fearful, we are that leaf, so to speak. We have no distance from it. We can't separate. One of the most helpful things that we can do to be not afraid is not to avoid that of which we're afraid, but rather to examine it, to be curious about it, to ask the question, why would that make me upset? What is it that I'm really afraid of? And then imagine taking that leaf, setting it down, and allowing it to drift on. This may not have been helpful for you at all. If so, leave that whole part of the talk like a leaf drifting down a river. But if it is, this is one of the things that you can do even if in 2 minutes before you sit down for an exam. Or in the minute as you face a friend who seems to be anxious and it makes you anxious. The second thing that we can do, do not be afraid, but be courageous in the midst of feeling afraid. Don't be afraid, but when you feel fear, when you feel anxiety, be courageous. I mentioned at the very beginning that I'd volunteered to speak in front of this crowd of 1,500 people. I knew at the time that I agreed to that, I knew there would come a moment that I would regret that decision. And for me, the moment came about exactly 1 week ago at chapel time. And at that moment, I deeply, at the bodily level, deeply regretted that. My anxiety surged, my stomach clenched up, my mind started racing. Every insecure thought I could imagine came into my mind. But I knew it ahead of time. 10 minutes before I stepped up here, another surge. I felt anxious. I felt afraid. One of the things that God allows us in these embodied souls of ours is to feel afraid and yet to choose that thing of which we're afraid. This is, in therapy sessions, this is called exposure. And it turns out it's one of the most effective things you can do to be not afraid, is to move towards that thing of which you're afraid and to stay there for long enough that your body can come back down again, because your body always comes back down again. This is courage. Courage is feeling fear and choosing to do something nevertheless. We oftentimes think of courage as not feeling afraid at all. Those people who have no fear. That's sociopathy. Courage is feeling afraid, knowing it, and taking a step anyway. So what makes us courageous? Sometimes reading a verse like this, sometimes reorienting my mind to the actual reality that's around us. But one of the great gifts that God gives us to be courageous is the person sitting to your left and the person sitting to your right, the person that you call at night, the person that you think of in the morning. Why could I step onto this stage in the midst of gut-wrenching anxiety? In part, because I have students out there right now amongst you who have known me and who have seen me and who have encouraged me. Students who have said with their eyes and with their words, "We believe in you. Please move forward, step into your anxiety. We want you to." My wife, my children, In fact, the third thing that you can do, be not afraid, but be the grace for someone else who is feeling afraid. For those of us who feel any anxiety, sometimes when we see someone else feeling afraid, we're tempted to move back. We get paralyzed. We want to shuffle them off somewhere else, or we want to avert our attention. We start to feel distressed. One of the most helpful things you can do if you know someone who is afraid, who feels anxiety, who has an anxiety disorder, or simply is at a place in their life where they feel fear, is to be present with them. One of the amazing gifts of our bodies and our minds and the way that they function is when you look deeply into the eyes of another person, your limbic systems start to attune to one another. Your brain literally starts mirroring their brain. We do this at a distance, and we do it almost magically. It's incredible. Our mirror neurons help us to center on another person. If you can be the person who sits with someone who is anxious, you don't have to fix it. You don't have to proof text why they shouldn't be afraid. You can simply sit with them and perhaps even vulnerably tell them about a time that you were afraid. Be with them. Be the community of God. Do not be afraid, but allow yourself the grace of God when you feel afraid. Do not be afraid, but be courageous in the midst of feeling afraid. And do not be afraid, but be God's embodied grace for someone who is feeling afraid. As a community, you, the staff, the faculty, Point Loma, this community has been the grace of God to me. And for that, I'm tremendously thankful. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you. In the midst of lives that may be filled with anxiety, in the midst of a moment in which we may feel the surge of fear, we thank you. We thank you for these bodies that sometimes feel like they betray us. We thank you for the wisdom and the grace that you offer us through them. And God, we thank you. I thank you tremendously for the grace of these people sitting here. I thank you for the gift of each one of them, their lives, their minds, and eyes that show each other love. I've seen and witnessed day after day the ways in which you love your people through your people. And I ask that you would be with each of us. Help us to be not afraid, but allow us to feel your grace and the freedom to feel afraid without knowing that that's the truth. God, I thank you for these students. I ask that you would be with them and be with this community going forward. Amen.